In 1953, a man was democratically elected. He wanted his country's oil back, and within months, the CIA had him removed from power. In 1954, another elected leader tried to give land to poor farmers, and again, the CIA destroyed his government. In 1961, they trained an army of exiles, sent them to invade Cuba, and watched the whole operation collapse into the sea. In the 1980s, they armed fighters in Afghanistan to bleed the Soviet Union dry. And those same fighters, those same weapons, those same networks would later kill thousands of Americans on September 11th. This is not conspiracy theory. This is documented history. This is the CIA's Black Book, and today we are reading every page. The Central Intelligence Agency was born in 1947, out of the ashes of World War II. America had just seen what happens when you don't have good intelligence, Pearl Harbor. So President Truman signed the National Security Act and created an agency whose sole purpose was to gather information and, when necessary, act on it secretly. That word, secretly, is where everything gets complicated. Because covert action is not just about gathering information. It's about changing outcomes, toppling governments, starting wars that never appear in newspapers, funding revolutions without leaving fingerprints. The CIA was given a legal mandate for plausible deniability, meaning if they get caught, the President of the United States can look at the world and say, "We had nothing to do with it." That is the architecture of deception that this agency was built on. And for 7 decades, it has used that architecture to reshape the world, sometimes brilliantly, sometimes catastrophically, always secretly. Let's go to Iran. 1953. Mohammad Mossadegh is the prime minister. He's educated, democratic, and wildly popular. And he has done something that has sent shockwaves through London and Washington. He has nationalized Iran's oil. For decades, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, a British company, had been extracting Iranian oil and sending the profits back to Britain. Mossadegh said enough. He said, "This is our land, our oil, our wealth." The British were furious. They went to the Americans. And the Americans, already terrified of Soviet influence spreading through the Middle East, agreed to act. The operation was called Ajax, or in British intelligence circles, Operation Boot. The CIA's Kermit Roosevelt Jr. flew into Tehran with one mission: remove Mossadegh. He didn't bring tanks. He brought money. He bribed newspaper editors to run propaganda smearing Mossadegh as a communist. He paid thugs to cause riots in the streets. He funded clerics to turn religious sentiment against the prime minister. He bought off military generals one by one. Within weeks, the streets of Tehran were in chaos. Mossadegh was arrested. The Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, was reinstated as an absolute monarch, a king who would do exactly what Washington told him. The CIA celebrated. They had spent less than $1 million and removed the government without firing a single shot. But here's what they did not calculate. The Iranian people never forgot. They knew what happened. The resentment festered for 26 years, and in 1979 it exploded. The Islamic Revolution swept the Shah from power, took 52 American diplomats hostage for 444 days, and turned Iran into one of America's most enduring adversaries. The CIA's $1 million shortcut created a 40-year crisis. That is the true price of Operation Ajax. 1 year later, 1954, Guatemala. Jacobo Renz is the president. He's also democratically elected. And he has introduced land reform, taking large, uncultivated estates from wealthy landowners and distributing them to poor indigenous farmers. Sounds reasonable. Unless you are the United Fruit Company, an American corporation that owns massive swaths of Guatemalan land and has deep political connections inside the Eisenhower administration. The company labeled Renz a communist. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, who had previously worked as a lawyer for United Fruit, called Renz a threat to hemispheric security. His brother, Alan Dulles, was the director of the CIA. The operation was called PABSUX. The CIA trained a small rebel army in Honduras. They ran a pirate radio station broadcasting fake news, fake troop movements, fake victories to terrify the Guatemalan military. They flew aircraft over the capital dropping leaflets. They created the illusion of an unstoppable revolution. The Guatemalan army, convinced that a massive US-backed invasion was imminent, turned on their own president. Rebenz resigned. He went into exile, broken, and eventually died in a bathtub in Mexico City. Some say in despair, some say under suspicious circumstances. What followed in Guatemala was not democracy. It was a military dictatorship that lasted for decades. A civil war that killed 200,000 people, the majority of them indigenous Mayan civilians, in a conflict that the United Nations later described as genocide. All of this to protect a fruit company's profits. The CIA called Peep Sucks one of its greatest successes. History calls it something very different. Now we move to the most famous failure in CIA history, the Bay of Pigs, 1961. Fidel Castro has taken power in Cuba, aligned himself with the Soviet Union, and nationalized American businesses on the island. He is 90 miles from Florida, and he is a communist, and Washington is losing its mind. The Eisenhower administration approved a plan to train Cuban exiles, men who had fled Castro's revolution, arm them, put them on boats, land them on Cuba, and hope that the Cuban people would rise up and overthrow Castro. The CIA was confident. Their analysts told them the Cuban people secretly hated Castro. That confidence was spectacularly wrong. On April 17, 1961, Brigade 2506-1400 Cuban exile fighters hit the beaches at the Bay of Pigs. Castro's forces were waiting. The element of surprise was gone because the plan had been poorly kept. President Kennedy, in his first months in office, had already grown uneasy about the operation. He'd canceled the planned U.S. airstrikes at the last moment, afraid of the optics of America openly attacking Cuba. Without air cover, the Exile Brigade was exposed. Within 3 days, it was over. More than 100 men were dead. Nearly 1,200 were captured. Castro paraded them on television. The humiliation for the United States was total and global. Kennedy took public responsibility, but privately he was furious at the CIA for overselling the plan. Castro, now vindicated, became more powerful than ever. The Soviet Union, watching America's incompetence, doubled down on their alliance with Cuba. And that relationship that emboldened Soviet confidence led directly to what happened in October 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the world came closer to nuclear war than at any point in human history. The Bay of Pigs did not just fail. It created a crisis that nearly ended civilization. But not all CIA operations used armies or coups. Some of the most powerful were invisible, a war fought with words, images, and ideas. During the Cold War, the CIA understood that the battlefield was not just geography. It was the human mind. If you could convince people in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, that American democracy was vibrant and free, and Soviet communism was gray and oppressive, you could win the Cold War without firing a shot. This was Operation Mockingbird, and it was one of the most ambitious propaganda operations in history. The CIA secretly funded literary magazines. They paid journalists at major American newspapers to write stories that aligned with U.S. foreign policy. They funded the Congress for Cultural Freedom, an organization that appeared to be a spontaneous gathering of the world's greatest intellectuals, poets, philosophers, novelists, all celebrating Western values. It was entirely funded and directed by the CIA, and almost none of its members knew it. They sent jazz musicians, including Louis Armstrong, on world tours, presenting American culture as creative, free, and joyful. They published books. They funded abstract art movements. They shaped what educated people around the world believed about America and about the Soviet Union. When this was finally revealed in the late 1960s, the intellectual world was shaken. Writers and thinkers who believed they had been exercising independent judgment discovered they had been instruments of state propaganda. The question it raised then, and raises now, is this: When a government secretly manipulates what people think and believe, is that freedom, or is it just a more sophisticated form of tyranny? While America debated the Vietnam War publicly, the CIA was running an entirely separate, entirely secret war in the country next door, Laos. From 1961 to 1975, the CIA built and commanded a private army of approximately 30,000 Hmong fighters, an ethnic minority group from the mountains of Laos. The Hmong, led by General Vang Pao, fought with extraordinary courage against the Communist Pathet Lao and North Vietnamese forces. They disrupted supply lines. They rescued downed American pilots. They fought and died in numbers that were staggering. The CIA supplied them using a private airline, Air America, that flew across Southeast Asia carrying weapons, ammunition, food, and soldiers, all completely outside any congressional oversight or public knowledge. For over a decade, this was one of the largest paramilitary operations America had ever conducted, and almost no one knew it was happening. And then, in 1975, when America withdrew from Southeast Asia in defeat, the CIA's commitments to the Hmong people evaporated overnight. The Communist Pathet Lao took power. Thousands of Hmong who had fought for America were hunted down and killed. Tens of thousands fled into the jungle, crossed the Mekong River into Thailand, lived in refugee camps for years. Eventually, many settled in the United States, in Minnesota, in California, in Wisconsin, carrying with them a grief and a betrayal that has never fully healed. The secret war in Laos is not a story of intelligence failure. It is a story of a promise made in secret and broken in silence. By the mid-1970s, the weight of secrets had become too heavy to hold. The Watergate scandal had shattered public trust in government. Investigative journalists were digging into things that had always been buried. And in 1975, the United States Senate convened the Church Committee, named for its chairman, Senator Frank Church of Idaho, to investigate exactly what the CIA had been doing for 30 years. What they found was extraordinary. The CIA had plotted to assassinate foreign leaders, Fidel Castro, the Congolese Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba, and others. They had tested mind control drugs on American citizens without their consent in a program called MKUltra. They had conducted domestic surveillance on American civil rights leaders, anti-war activists, and journalists, people who had committed no crime beyond disagreeing with government policy. Senator Church stood before the nation and called the CIA a rogue elephant, an agency that had grown so powerful, so secretive, so unaccountable that it had begun operating entirely outside the democratic values it claimed to defend. The hearings led to real reforms. Congressional oversight committees were established. An executive order was signed banning the CIA from participating in the assassination of foreign leaders. The agency was, for the first time, placed under genuine scrutiny. But as history would prove, the elephant was not broken. It had simply learned to walk more quietly. Afghanistan, 1979. The Soviet Union invades. For the CIA, this is the moment they have been waiting for, a chance to give the Soviets their own Vietnam, a bleeding wound that would drain their military and their economy. The operation was called Cyclone, and it became the most expensive covert operation in CIA history. Working closely with Pakistan's intelligence service, the ISI, the CIA funneled billions of dollars in weapons and cash to the Afghan Mujahideen, the fighters resisting the Soviet occupation. They provided Stinger anti-aircraft missiles, which transformed the battlefield. Soviet helicopter gunships, the most feared weapon in their arsenal, began falling from Afghan skies. The Soviets couldn't advance, couldn't hold territory, couldn't stop the bleeding. By 1989, they withdrew. The Soviet Union, already weakened, collapsed 2 years later. The CIA was triumphant. Operation Cyclone was hailed as a masterpiece. And then the Americans went home. They left behind a country with no government, no infrastructure, and millions of weapons. The Mujahideen factions turned on each other. A brutal civil war tore Afghanistan apart. From the chaos and the destruction, a movement rose to power, the Taliban. And among the foreign fighters who had come to Afghanistan to wage jihad against the Soviets, fighters whose networks and training the CIA had indirectly supported, was a young Saudi named Osama bin Laden. The weapons, the training, the organizational networks built to destroy the Soviet Union were still there. And on September 11, 2001, they were used in a different direction. This is what intelligence professionals call blowback. The unintended consequences of covert action that come back to wound the hand that launched them. Afghanistan is the most devastating example in American history. Here is what all of these stories have in common. Every single one of these operations was launched by intelligent, patriotic people who believed they were protecting their country. Every single one was justified at the time by the logic of national security. And every single one produced consequences that its architects never anticipated. Consequences that, in many cases, created far greater dangers than the threats they were designed to prevent. Iran 1953 gave us the 1979 revolution and 40 years of hostility. Guatemala 1954 gave us decades of military dictatorship and genocide. Bay of Pigs gave us the Cuban Missile Crisis. The secret war in Laos gave us the betrayal of the Hmong people. Afghanistan gave us the Taliban and contributed to the conditions that produced September 11th. This is not an argument that covert action is always wrong. There are operations, intelligence gathered, threats prevented, genuine dangers neutralized that never make the history books because they never became catastrophes. But it is an argument for accountability, for oversight, for the simple democratic principle that a government derives its authority from the consent of the governed, and you cannot consent to what you do not know. The CIA's Black Book is not just a record of operations. It is a ledger of choices made in darkness, on your behalf, with consequences you were never asked to approve. The question is not whether secrets are sometimes necessary. The question is who decides, and who pays the price when they get it wrong. Because in almost every chapter of this book, it is not the architects of these operations who pay. It is the people of Iran, Guatemala, Cuba, Laos, Afghanistan, and ultimately, it is ordinary Americans who live with the blowback for generations. That is the real weight of the CIA's Black Book. Not the operations themselves, but the silence around them, and the world that silence has built.